The black, rib soles of my boots have not touched natural soil in 300 standard years. Yet the copper tang of the aspirant's trial remains thick on my tongue, as fresh as the day the selection tithe claimed my sub-sector. We were 10,000 nameless sons of the hive spires, gathered in the shadow of a gargantuan fortress, monastery that breathed heat like a dying god, our ribs visible beneath skin caked in chem, ash and the grey grime of the low levels. There was no ceremony. No rousing speech to stir the blood of the desperate, only the rhythmic, hydraulic hiss of the iron gates and the cold, unblinking lenses of the chapter's serfs as they measured our worth in bone density and lung capacity. To be chosen was not an act of grace, but a sentence of total erasure, a systematic dismantling of the self until nothing remained but a vessel for the Emperor's holy, agonizing transhumanism. If you still walk beside me through fire and scripture, then bear witness. Subscribe, share this burden, and let others hear the truth buried beneath hymns. The transition from the squalor of the hive to the sterile, terrifying cold of the fortress, monastery was not marked by a single step, but by the rhythmic, soul-crushing thud of hydraulic clamps sealing us away from the world of the living forever. I remember the air changed first. It lost the thick, organic rot of the lower levels and replaced it with something far more predatory, a dry, recycled atmosphere that tasted of ozone, ancient incense, and the sharp, metallic tang of blood work. We were stripped of our rags, our names, and the meager trinkets of our former lives, cast into a communal chamber of wet stone and weeping iron, where the only warmth came from the bodies of the boys huddled beside us. I felt the vibration of the mountain itself, a deep sonic thrum that suggested the presence of engines, so vast they could swallow a city whole. A mechanical heartbeat that demanded total subservience from every soul within its reach. We were no longer children of fathers and mothers, but raw material for the Apothecarian, a harvest of flesh intended to be broken and reforged in the fires of a tradition that spanned 10 millennia of uninterrupted slaughter. The silence of the masters was the most terrifying aspect of those early days, a quietude that felt like the stillness of a predator watching its prey through a high-velocity scope. We were watched by the serfs, men and women whose faces were masks of scar tissue and bionic implants, their movements efficient and devoid of any human heat, as they recorded our every tremor and every whispered prayer into humming data slates. They did not speak to us unless it was to bark a command that sent us scrambling through the dark, through corridors that smelled of wet copper and the chemical sharpener used on chainsword teeth. I remember looking at my hands in the dim light of a flickering lumen strip and realizing they were shaking not from the cold, but from the sudden, jarring realization that my previous life had been a dream from which I had been violently awakened. The hive had been a place of noise and heat, of the desperate struggle for a handful of nutrient paste, but this place was a tomb designed for the manufacture of demi-gods, and the weight of the stone above us felt as though it were pressing directly against my skull. Hunger was our constant companion, but it was a different kind of starvation than the one we had known in the sumps, for this was a hunger designed to test the limits of our willpower and the resilience of our internal organs. We were fed a grey, gelatinous slurry that tasted of salt and processed minerals, a substance that felt heavy in the gut and seemed to burn as it went down, fueling the frantic, unnatural growth that the chapter's masters began to cultivate within us. We spent hours in forced meditation, kneeling on the jagged floors of vaulted chapels, while the air grew thick with the smoke of holy oils, our knees bleeding onto the cold flagstones as we were forced to recite the litanies of hate until our voices were nothing but rasps. It was during these long vigils that I first saw one of the battle brothers up close, a giant clad in robes of deep crimson that failed to hide the impossible bulk of his frame, his eyes 2 chips of frozen flint that seemed to look through my flesh and into the marrow of my bones. He did not look at us with pity, or even with the pride of a mentor. He looked at us as a sculptor looks at a block of unhewn granite, searching for the flaws that would cause the stone to shatter under the first strike of the chisel. The physical trials began before the sun had even crested the jagged peaks of the monastery's perimeter, starting with the long ascent, a climb up the sheer interior walls of the training silos that left our fingernails torn and our lungs screaming for oxygen that wasn't there. I watched boys I had spoken to only hours before lose their grip and tumble into the lightless abyss below, their screams cut short by the wet crunch of bone against iron, and I learned then the first lesson of the Astartes. The weak are not merely discarded, they are recycled. There was no time for mourning, no pause in the relentless rhythm of the trial. For the serfs were behind us with electric prods, and the barking commands of those who knew only the necessity of the cull. We were pushed through labyrinthine corridors filled with toxic gases, forced to find our way out using only our senses and the desperate intuition of the hunted, our skin blistering and our eyes weeping as we crawled through the filth and the dark. Every hour was a new measurement of our worth, a new opportunity to fail and be forgotten, and I found myself retreating into a cold, hard space within my mind where the pain could not reach. A fortress of my own making that mirrored the one that held us captive. By the end of the first month, the 10,000 had been reduced to a few hundred, and the air in the barracks grew thinner as the space around us expanded with the absence of the fallen. We were no longer the frightened children who had stood at the gates. We were something leaner, harder, and infinitely more dangerous. Our eyes hollowed out by exhaustion, and our spirits tempered by the constant proximity of death. I remember the taste of my own blood as I was forced to fight a boy twice my size in a pit of oily sand. The two of us driven by a primal urge to survive that transcended any notion of brotherhood or mercy. I broke his nose with a piece of scavenged rebar and watched the light fade from his eyes, not with joy, but with a grim, hollow satisfaction that I was still standing while he was not. The Apothecaries watched from the shadows, their nartheciums humming with a low, predatory energy, ready to harvest the organs of those who failed, so that nothing of the Emperor's tithe would be wasted. It was a cycle of consumption and refinement, a brutal alchemy that sought to extract the gold of a warrior's spirit from the leaden dross of human weakness. And I felt the heat of that furnace every time I closed my eyes. The psychological conditioning was perhaps the most invasive part of the process, a systematic invasion of our dreams and memories by the chapter's librarians and chaplains. We were strapped into chairs of cold brass and forced to watch flickering hololiths of the great enemy, our minds bombarded with images of such profound horror that some boys simply stopped breathing, their hearts giving out under the strain of the psychic assault. We were taught the history of the chapter, not as a series of dates and names, but as a living, bleeding tapestry of sacrifice and duty that we were expected to uphold at the cost of our very souls. I felt my own memories of the hive beginning to fray at the edges, the faces of my kin dissolving into the grey mists of the past, until the only reality was the cold iron of the monastery and the iron, hard will of the Emperor. They replaced our fear with a righteous, burning hatred, a fire that consumed everything it touched until only the mission remained. A singularity of purpose that stripped away the complexities of the human heart and replaced them with the stark, unyielding logic of the war machine. As the time for the first augmentations drew near, the atmosphere in the monastery shifted from one of testing to one of preparation for a holy sacrifice. We were led into the deeper vaults, places where the walls were lined with the stasis, coffins of ancient heroes, and the air was so thick with the smell of antiseptics and old blood that it felt like walking through a slaughterhouse. The tech priests of the Mechanicus moved among us like spindly, metallic spiders, their mechadendrites twitching as they calibrated the massive surgical suites where our transformation would begin. I saw the black carapace, The subdermal mesh that would one day interface with our power armor, lying on a tray of polished chrome like the skin of a flayed beast, and I felt a cold shiver of anticipation that was almost indistinguishable from terror. This was the point of no return, the threshold beyond which we would cease to be human and become something both more and less than the men who had sired us. I looked at the boy next to me, a quiet youth with a jagged scar across his brow, and saw in his eyes the same grim acceptance that I felt in my own chest, a realization that we were already dead, and that what would emerge from these vaults would be a weapon, forged in the dark and whetted on the stone of our own suffering. The first surgery was a descent into a hell of white light and searing agony, a process that felt as though my very DNA were being unraveled and rewoven by the hands of a sadistic god. I remember the sensation of the bone, strengthening ceramic being injected into my marrow, a heat so intense it felt as though my skeleton were being forged in a blast furnace, and the sound of my own screams echoing back from the sterile walls, until my throat was raw and bleeding. They did not use enough anesthetic to dull the pain, for the pain was part of the process, a necessary catalyst for the biological changes that were being forced upon our bodies. I drifted in a sea of fevered dreams, seeing the golden light of the Golden Throne and the endless, skeletal armies of the warp, my mind fracturing under the pressure of the chemical and psychic cocktails that were being pumped into my veins. When I finally awoke, my body felt heavy and alien, my muscles twitching with a strength I could not control and my senses dialed to a pitch that made the humming of the lumens sound like the roar of a jet engine. I was no longer a child of the hive. I was a neophyte, a creature of the laboratory and the killing ground, and the path ahead was a long, bloody road that would only end in a grave of alien soil or the cold embrace of a dreadnought sarcophagus. The secondary heart was the first true intruder to claim residence within my chest, a rhythmic, violent throb that felt like a trapped bird beating its wings against a cage of reinforced bone. I remember lying in the recovery slab, my vision swimming in a sea of chemical yellow and bruised violet, listening to the dual cadence of my own life, a frantic, overlapping drumming that seemed to mock the singular pulse of the boy I used to be. Every breath was a struggle against the new density of my ribs, which had been fused into a solid, interlocking plate of biological armor that sat like a leaden weight upon my lungs. The Apothecaries did not offer words of comfort as they moved between the rows of twitching, feverish initiates. They merely checked the flow of nutrient slurry and the integrity of the seals, their movements as precise and unfeeling as the clockwork of a great clock. We were being rebuilt from the foundation upward, our very biology rewritten to accommodate the demands of a war that did not recognize the concept of exhaustion. I felt the osmodula working within me, a dull, aching heat that radiated from my marrow as my skeleton thickened and grew, stretching my skin until it felt as thin as parchment and as tight as a drumhead. I watched the others in the dim, flickering light of the recovery ward, seeing the way their bodies warped and expanded under the influence of the gene, seed, some faces becoming unrecognizable masks of swelling muscle and protruding bone. Not everyone survived the integration of the Biscopia. I saw one youth, a boy who had survived the trials of the rad, wastes with a defiant grin, succumb to a massive seizure as his own muscles tore themselves from his skeletal frame in a frenzy of uncontrolled growth. The sound of his tendons snapping was like the cracking of dry timber in a forest fire, a sharp, wet noise that was immediately drowned out by the low, chanting drone of a nearby servo skull recording his death throes for the chapter's archives. There was no burial for him, only the swift arrival of the servitor, teams to harvest what viable tissue remained before consigning the rest to the protein reclamation vats. We learned to look away, to focus our entire existence on the internal battle of our own cells, for to acknowledge the fallen was to invite the realization that we were all merely experimental subjects in a process with a terrifyingly high margin of error. When the time came for us to stand, the world felt distorted, as if the gravity of the monastery had suddenly increased tenfold, forcing us to relearn the basic mechanics of movement with limbs that were now longer, heavier, and vastly more powerful. My first steps were clumsy, jarring impacts that cracked the floor tiles, my brain struggling to process the flood of sensory data coming from nerves that had been sharpened to a razor's edge. We were ushered into the training cages, a labyrinth of jagged metal and electrified wire where the serfs awaited us with weighted batons and low, output shock staves. There was no respite for the newly augmented. The chapter demanded that we master our new bodies in the crucible of pain, forcing us to fight through the haze of post-surgical trauma until our reactions became instinctive. I remember the taste of iron and the smell of scorched hair as a shock staff caught me across the neck, the surge of adrenaline from my newly installed biscopia turning my vision a vivid, pulsing red. I struck back not with the desperate flailing of a child, but with the calculated, crushing force of a predator. My fist caving in the chest, plate of a training servitor with a sound that filled me with a dark, terrifying sense of empowerment. The indoctrination intensified alongside the physical reshaping, a relentless psychic hammering that sought to replace our personal memories with the collective trauma and glory of the chapter. We were submerged in sensory deprivation tanks, our minds linked to ancient data, stacks that flooded our consciousness with the tactical doctrines of the Codex Astartes and the recorded memories of long, dead heroes. I saw the fall of empires through the eyes of warriors who had died millennia before I was born, felt the heat of alien suns on my face, and the spray of Xeno's blood against my Vesa, my own childhood. The face of the mother who had wept when the tithe, ships arrived, the smell of the chemical, rain in the hive. These things began to feel like scenes from a poorly remembered hololith, flickering and fading into the background of a much larger, much grimmer reality. The chaplains stood over our tanks, their voices a constant, low-frequency rumble that vibrated in our very teeth, reciting the litany of hate and the creed of the iron will until the words became the very architecture of our thoughts. We were being taught that the galaxy was a place of infinite shadow, where the only light was the glow of a bolter's muzzle, flash, and the only truth was the loyalty we owed to the golden throne. I remember the first time I felt the black carapace being grafted beneath my skin, a systematic flaying of my torso that felt as though I were being wrapped in a shroud of needles. The tech priests worked with a terrifying efficiency, their mechadendrites weaving the sub-dermal sensors into my nervous system with a precision that bypassed the need for traditional sutures. It was a cold, invasive sensation, a feeling of being permanently tethered to a machine, as if my very soul were being wired into the vox grid of the monastery. When the procedure was finished, I felt a strange, phantom itching across my entire chest and back, the interface ports protruding from my flesh like the sockets of some great, unliving engine. I was no longer a creature of nature, but a hybrid of flesh and holy silicon, a living interface designed to commune with the machine, spirit of power armor. To touch the ports was to feel the vibration of the monastery's reactors, a subtle hum that reminded me that I was now a part of the chapter's vast industrial infrastructure, a cog in a machine of war that had been turning since the dawn of the Imperium. Dietary requirements became a matter of chemical engineering rather than sustenance, as we were transitioned to a diet of nutrient-dense pasts and synthetic hormones designed to stabilize our volatile metabolisms. We ate in silence, seated at long tables of cold basalt beneath the banners of the fallen, the only sound the rhythmic clatter of metal spoons against bowls. The food was tasteless, a gray sludge that sat heavy in the stomach, but it provided the raw materials our bodies needed to sustain the frantic pace of our transformation. I could feel my organs shifting, expanding, and hardening, my skin taking on a waxy, unnatural sheen as the Laraman's organ began to flood my system with its clotting agents. I cut my hand on a piece of jagged metal during a maintenance ritual and watched in silent awe as the wound sealed itself in seconds, the blood thickening into a tough, leathery scab before it could even drip to the floor. It was a miracle of biological engineering that felt more like a curse, a reminder that I was being stripped of my humanity, one physiological function at a time, until even the simple act of bleeding was no longer my own. The trials of the mind were as grueling as the trials of the flesh, as we were subjected to simulated environments that pushed our sanity to the breaking point. I was cast into a darkness so absolute that even my enhanced vision could find no purchase, forced to navigate a maze of shifting walls and hidden traps while the sounds of a battlefield raged around me. I heard the voices of my dead comrades calling to me from the shadows, their pleas for mercy interwoven with the discordant shrieks of the war, and I had to learn to shut them out, to harden my heart against the seduction of empathy. The librarians watched from their high balconies, their psychic presence a cold weight on the edge of my mind, searching for any flicker of doubt or hesitation that would mark me as unfit for the final transition. I learned to find comfort in the cold logic of the tactical manuals, to see the world not as a place of beauty or emotion, but as a series of firing solutions and defensive perimeters. My identity was being slowly ground down, the rough edges of my personality polished away by the constant friction of the chapter's demands, until I was as smooth and unyielding as a bolter shell. By the time the final stages of the transformation approached, the group of initiates I had entered the vaults with had been whittled down to a mere handful of survivors. We were the elite of the elite, the few who had not broken under the scalpel or the psychic lash, and we looked at each other with a grim, silent understanding. There was no camaraderie in the traditional sense, no shared jokes or dreams of the future, only a mutual recognition of the scars we bore and the burden we were about to take up. We were the inheritors of a legacy of blood, the latest batch of fuel for the eternal fire of the Emperor's crusade, and we accepted our fate with a stoicism that would have been impossible for us only months before. I felt a strange sense of peace in the heart of the monastery, a realization that the struggle of my previous life was over, and that my new existence, however brief and violent it might be, had a purpose that transcended the petty concerns of the hive. We were becoming the angels of death, and the galaxy would tremble at our footfalls, even as we lost the last vestiges of the boys we had once been. The final vigil before the awakening of our full potential was spent in the Hall of Heroes, a chamber of such monumental scale that the ceiling was lost in a permanent haze of incense smoke. We knelt before the statues of the chapter's founders, our naked, augmented bodies appearing small and fragile against the backdrop of their stone magnificence. I looked up at the face of the Primarch, carved from a single block of obsidian, and felt a surge of something that might have been pride if my emotions had not been so thoroughly cauterized. I was a part of him now, a distant, reconstructed echo of his divine will, and I swore a silent oath to the cold, unmoving stone that I would not fail. The air in the hall was still, save for the low, rhythmic thrum of the monastery's life support systems, a sound that felt like the breathing of a sleeping titan. We waited in the dark, the fire of our new hearts beating in unison, prepared to step out of the shadows of our childhood and into the blinding light of eternal war. The induction of the black carapace was the moment I ceased to be a tenant in my own skin and became a permanent resident of a living weapon. I remember the sensation not as a surgery, but as a systematic colonization of my nervous system by a cold, unyielding intellect of fiber, optics and sensor bundles. The surgeons of the chapter did not use the gentle touch of a healer. They worked with the heavy, handed necessity of a master smith riveting plates to a hull, their drills wearing through my newly hardened dermis to seat the neural interface sockets directly into my spinal column. I was awake for much of it, my mind held in a state of lucid stasis by chemical dampeners, that allowed me to feel every needle, prick of the loom as it wove the sub-dermal mesh across my chest and back. It felt as though a second skin of freezing mercury was being poured beneath my flesh, a weight that did not merely sit upon me, but integrated itself into the very electrical impulses of my brain. When the first diagnostic pulses were sent through the grid, my entire body arched off the stone slab in a violent, involuntary spasm, my vision exploding into a static field of tactical data and bio-readouts that I did not yet know how to interpret. I spent weeks in the neural acclimation vaults, a series of lightless chambers where the only reality was the flickering green text of the interface scrolling across the insides of my eyelids. Every twitch of a finger produced a cascade of sensory feedback. The black carapace was learning the map of my muscles, calibrating its response times to match the frantic speed of my augmented reflexes. It was a period of profound sensory distortion, where the boundary between my physical self and the machine spirit of the monastery seemed to dissolve. I could feel the hum of the power conduits in the walls through the soles of my feet, the vibration of the great ventilation fans 3 levels above us, and the rhythmic clicking of the servitors' heavy footfalls as they patrolled the corridors. The world had become a tapestry of data points, heat signatures, acoustic vibrations, and chemical scents, all filtered through the cold, logical lens of the carapace. I was no longer a boy who felt the wind or the cold. I was a sensor, a ray that detected atmospheric pressure and thermal variance. The humanity I had clung to during the trials was being systematically replaced by a suit of tactical advantages, a trade I accepted with the hollow, grinding hunger of a creature that had been taught to value nothing but its own lethality. The training shifted from the survival of the individual to the cohesion of the squad. As we were grouped into the 5-man units that would define our existence for the next century of warfare, my brothers were no longer rivals to be bested, but extensions of my own tactical awareness, our movements synchronized by the low-frequency vox thrum that now pulsed in our ears. We practiced the art of the room, clear and the tactical advance in the ruins of the killing houses, areas of the monastery designed to simulate the shattered landscapes of 1,000 different war zones. I remember the smell of burnt promethium and the taste of pulverized stone as we moved through the simulated urban decay, our every step a measured, violent precision. We were taught the holy geometry of the bolter, how to lead a target through a haze of smoke, and how to conserve our fire until the moment of maximum lethality. My hands, once clumsy and shaking in the hive sumps, were now rock steady, the weight of a training bolter feeling as natural as the weight of my own limbs. I felt a dark, cold joy in the rhythm of the fire, drill, the kick of the weapon, the scent of the propellant, and the satisfying destruction of the target drones, a purpose so singular it left no room for the ghosts of my past. Instruction in the chapter's secret rites and the preservation of our wargear became a daily sacrament, overseen by the tech, marines, and the chaplains in the flickering shadows of the reclusium. We were taught that our armor was not merely a suit of protective plating, but a holy reliquary that housed the machine, spirit of 1,000 previous owners. We learned the canticles of maintenance, the specific oils required for the leg actuators, and the prayers for the awakening of the power pack. I watched as a senior battle brother was ceremonially sealed into his Mark V plate, a process that took hours of meticulous work by a dozen serfs and a pair of servitors. The sound of the bolts being torqued into place, the hiss of the pneumatic seals, and the deep, guttural roar of the backpack's engine igniting was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. It represented the final stage of our ascension, the moment when the biological monster we had become would be given the steel skin it deserved. I looked at the interface ports on my own arms and felt a desperate, aching longing for that transformation, a desire to be encased in the cold embrace of ceramite so that the world could never touch my vulnerable flesh again. The mental conditioning took on a more aggressive tone, as we were subjected to hypno-indoctrination, a process that involved being strapped into a sensory throne while our brains were force-fed the tactical histories of our chapter. I saw the Great Crusade not as a legend, but as a series of logistical maps and casualty reports. I saw the Horus Heresy not as a tragedy, but as a lesson in the necessity of eternal vigilance. The images were burned into my retinue, flashing at a speed that would have blinded a normal human, until the memories of the chapter's greatest victories felt as though they were my own. I could recall the exact atmospheric composition of a world I had never visited, the weak point in the armor of a Xenos, beast I had never fought, and the specific litany required to calm a panicked civilian population before their inevitable execution. My personality was being rewritten by a library of violent data, the narrative of my life replaced by the narrative of the Imperium's survival. I found myself waking from sleep with the names of forgotten battlefields on my lips, my mind a churning sea of strategic imperatives and theological dogma that left no room for the quiet thoughts of a lonely child. Physical endurance was tested to the point of structural failure as we were marched across the frozen wastes of the monastery's exterior, our augmented lungs filtering the thin, oxygen, poor air while our Laraman cells worked overtime to heal the frostbite on our exposed skin. We were carrying hundreds of kilograms of training weight, our fused rib cages heaving with a rhythmic, mechanical sound that drowned out the howling of the wind. I remember a brother named Kale falling beside me, his legs snapping as he stepped into a hidden crevasse, the sound of the bone breaking muffled by the snow. He did not cry out. He merely began the litany of fortitude, dragging himself forward with his arms, while the rest of us continued the march without looking back. There was no room for pity, only the cold assessment of who could still function and who had become a liability. The chaplains followed us on bikes of black iron, their Crozius arcanums glowing with a dim, threatening light as they monitored our progress. To fall was to fail the Emperor. To stop was to betray the thousands of years of tradition that had brought us to this moment. We marched until our muscles burned with the heat of a sun and our vision blurred into a grey smear of exhaustion, driven by a will that was no longer entirely our own. The final phase of our training involved the trial of the knife, a ritual where we were cast out into the most dangerous sectors of the planet's wilderness, with nothing but a combat blade and our wits. I was dropped into a subterranean jungle of bioluminescent fungus and predatory megaflora, a place where the air was thick with neurotoxic spores and the shadows moved with the hunger of 1,000 hidden eyes. I spent 3 weeks in that green hell, my senses pushed to their absolute limits as I hunted the apex predators of the depths to prove my dominance. I ate their raw, stringy meat and drank the moisture from the cave walls, my augmented physiology filtering out the toxins that would have killed a normal man in minutes. I learned the language of the dark, the subtle shift in air pressure that signaled a strike and the scent of fear that radiated from my prey. When I finally emerged from the tunnels, my body lean and hard as a piece of obsidian, I carried the skull of a subterranean carnivore as a trophy. I was no longer a recruit, I was a hunter, a creature of the dark who had mastered the environment that was meant to consume him. Returning to the monastery, the atmosphere had changed from one of testing to one of solemn initiation. We were no longer referred to as aspirants or neophytes, but as brothers in waiting, our names finally recorded in the great ledger of the chapter. I stood in the shadow of the Apothecarian, watching the transport ships arrive with a new crop of terrified boys from the hives, and I felt a strange, detached sense of distance. They looked so small, so fragile, their lives so fleeting and inconsequential. I realized then that the process was complete. The boy I had been was dead, buried under layers of muscle, bone, and neural circuitry. What remained was a vessel for the Emperor's wrath, a living tool of the Imperium's will that was ready to be sharpened on the whetstone of war. I looked at my hands, now scarred and massive, and saw not the hands of a human, but the claws of an angel of death, ready to descend into the fire and bring the light of the golden throne to a galaxy that deserved only the sword. The moment of our first true deployment was not heralded by a fanfare of trumpets, but by the hollow, metallic groan of the strike cruiser's launch tubes as they inhaled the void. We were no longer training in the simulated ruins of the monastery. We were scouts, the vanguard of the chapter, our bodies encased in the lighter, segmented plates of carapace armor that allowed for the silent, predatory movement required of the initiate. I remember the smell of the drop pod, a suffocating mixture of recycled air, holy unguents, and the sharp ozone scent of the restraint harnesses. There was no light inside the pod save for the rhythmic, amber pulse of the tactical display and the faint, green glow of my brother's eye lenses. We sat in a silence so profound it felt as though the universe itself were holding its breath, our twin hearts beating in a syncopated rhythm that felt like the drumming of a war engine. I could feel the black carapace twitching beneath my skin, its sensors reaching out to interface with the pod's machine, spirit, giving me a ghostly, wire-frame vision of the atmospheric entry that was about to begin. The drop was a violent, bone-shaking descent into a world that had been declared lost to the heretic. Gravity became a physical enemy, a crushing weight that sought to flatten our organs against the back of our seats. As the pod screamed through the upper atmosphere, I saw the heat shields glowing white, hot on the external monitors, the world outside a blur of fire and grey cloud, until the explosive bolts fired, and the sides of the pod fell away like the petals of a lethal flower. We emerged into a landscape of shattered glass and scorched iron, the air thick with the taste of ash and the distant, rhythmic thumping of heavy artillery. This was our first taste of the reality we had been forged for, not a clean, tactical exercise, but a chaotic, grinding meat grinder of a war zone where the line between life and death was measured in millimeters. I felt the adrenaline of my biskupia flood my system, a hot, electric surge that sharpened my focus until every floating particle of soot was a distinct, trackable object in my field of vision. Our mission was to infiltrate the ruins of a primary Vox relay, a skeletal spire of Gothic steel that rose like a jagged finger from the heart of the enemy, held industrial sector. We moved with a silence that defied our massive size, our boots finding purchase on the rubble with the practiced grace of mountain cats. I watched my sergeant, a veteran of 100 campaigns, whose face was a map of puckered scar tissue, signal the advance with a series of minute hand gestures that were mirrored instantly by the squad. There was no need for spoken words. Our neural links and shared tactical conditioning made us a single organism, a multi-headed beast of war that moved with a terrifying, singular purpose. I could smell the enemy before I saw them, the sour, unwashed stench of human fear and the oily, chemical tang of low-grade stimulants. They were cultists, wretched survivors of the hive who had traded their loyalty to the Emperor for the hollow promises of the great enemy. And they moved through the shadows with a frantic, disorganized energy that made them easy prey. The first kill was a revelation of the physical power I now possessed. I did not use my bolter, the mission required silence. And so I closed the distance between myself and a sentry with a burst of speed that felt like a teleportation. I caught him before he could even draw a breath to scream, my fingers closing around his throat with the crushing force of a hydraulic press. I felt the delicate structures of his neck shatter beneath my grip, the dry snap of bone echoing in the stillness of the ruin. He was so small, so incredibly fragile, that I felt a momentary surge of contempt for the species I had once belonged to. He died not as a man, but as a minor obstacle to be cleared, a smudge of biological waste that needed to be removed from the path of the Imperium's progress. I stepped over his cooling remains without a second thought, my mind already calculating the distance to the next target, and the thermal signature of the heavy stubber, nest located 3 floors above us. We reached the summit of the relay as the sun, a pale, sickly orb obscured by the smoke of 1,000 fires, began to set behind the jagged skyline. The air up there was thin and cold, whistling through the empty window, sockets of the spire like the moaning of a ghost. We set our charges with the methodical precision we had practiced in the monastery vaults, the mag clamps clicking into place against the rusted girders with a satisfying finality. I looked out over the city, seeing the ribbons of tracer fire weaving through the dark and the sudden, blooming mushrooms of explosions that marked the progress of the main Imperial force. We were the hidden knife in the dark, the unseen hand that would sever the enemy's communications and leave them blind for the slaughter to follow. I felt a cold, hard sense of satisfaction in the knowledge that I was the instrument of this destruction, a realization that my life now had a weight and a consequence that the boy in the hive could never have imagined. The extraction was a frantic, high-stakes race against time as the enemy realized our presence and flooded the lower levels of the spire with reinforcements. We descended through the elevator shafts, our combat blades humming with a low, killing energy as we carved through the waves of disorganized cultists. I remember the sensation of the blood spraying against my face, hot, copper tasting, and incredibly plentiful. My senses were a kaleidoscope of violence, the roar of the bolt pistol, the wet thud of my boots against yielding flesh, and the constant, rhythmic status reports flickering in my peripheral vision. I felt no fear, only a cold, analytical focus that allowed me to prioritize targets with a speed that felt like slowed time. We reached the landing zone just as the Stormhawk interceptor screamed overhead, its twin, linked heavy bolters clearing a path through the rubble with a thunderous, rhythmic roar. We vaulted into the hold, the hatch sealing shut on the world of fire and blood we had left behind, and I felt the first stirrings of a hunger that would never truly be satisfied, the hunger for the next battle, the next kill, the next opportunity to prove my worth to the chapter. Returning to the strike cruiser, the transition back to the sterile, incense-choked environment of the ship felt like a jarring shift in reality. We were led to the reclusium, our armor still caked in the grime and blood of the surface, to kneel before the chaplain and give thanks for our survival. He did not praise us. He merely reminded us that our success was the Emperor's will and that our failures were our own. We spent the next several hours in a state of meditative maintenance, cleaning our wardgear with a reverence that bordered on the erotic. Every scratch on the ceramite a badge of honor that needed to be recorded and blessed. I looked at the brothers seated around me, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the tallow candles, and saw the same transformation in them that I felt in myself. We were no longer the survivors of a trial. We were the practitioners of a holy craft. Our hands stained with the blood of the faithless, and our souls armored against the darkness of the galaxy. I realized then that the recruitment process never truly ends, it merely changes shape. We would spend our lives in this cycle of deployment and meditation, of violence and prayer, until the day our bodies finally failed us, and we were consigned to the chapter's sepulchres. The transition from human to transhuman was not a single event, but a continuous, grinding erosion of the self until nothing remained but the mission. I was a scout of the Imperium, a shadow in the dark, a silent promise of the death that was coming for every enemy of the Golden Throne. As the ship transitioned back into the warp, the flickering lights of the Geller field reflecting in the polished surface of my blade, I felt a profound, terrifying sense of belonging. I was exactly where I was meant to be, doing exactly what I had been forged to do. And the boy I had been was now nothing more than a ghost, haunting the corridors of a mind that had been repurposed for eternity. The final elevation to the rank of a full battle, brother, did not begin with a parade or the pinning of medals, but with the cold, absolute darkness of the sepulchre of the unfleshed. I stood alone in a chamber where the air was so ancient it felt as though it had been trapped since the time of the Great Crusade, my bare, augmented skin prickling against the freezing damp of the stone. This was the vigil of the black carapace's full awakening, the moment where the interface would be bonded permanently to the machine, spirit of a suit of power armor. I had spent years in the scout company, blooding my knife in the shadows of a dozen worlds, but I was still an incomplete thing, a weapon without its scabbard. Around me, the walls were lined with the sarcophagi of the chapters fallen, their stone effigies staring into the void with blind, unyielding eyes. I could hear the rhythmic, subterranean thrum of the monastery's core, a sound that seemed to synchronize with the dual thumping of my hearts until the mountain and the man were one single, vibrating entity. I was being watched, not by eyes, but by the weight of 10,000 years of history. A crushing pressure that demanded I prove my worth one final time before the chapter's deepest secrets were laid bare. The apothecaries and tech marines entered the chamber like ghosts, their movements silent save for the soft whirring of bionic joints and the rhythmic clink of holy oil canisters. They did not speak as they approached me, their faces hidden behind the cold, brass masks of their office. I felt the bite of the first needle as they injected the catalyst chemicals into my interface ports, a sensation like liquid fire being poured directly into my central nervous system. My vision fractured, the darkness of the tomb replaced by a cascading waterfall of binary cant and tactical data as the black carapace began its final integration. I was strapped into a vertical bracing frame of cold iron, my arms extended as if in crucifixion, while the heavy, rhythmic clatter of servitor claws announced the arrival of my inheritance, a suit of Mark Aquila power armor. It stood before me on a floating pallet, a suit of deep, midnight, blue ceramite that looked less like equipment and more like a hollowed-out god waiting to be inhabited. I could feel its machine spirit reaching out to mine, a low-frequency growl of predatory intent that made my very marrow ache with the desire for completion. The donning of the armor was a violent, invasive ritual that stripped away the last vestiges of my autonomy. I felt the heavy greaves being bolted onto my legs, the hydraulic clamps biting into the interface ports on my shins with a force that would have shattered a normal man's bone. The chest plate was lowered into place, a massive slab of reinforced ceramite that locked into the ports on my ribs and spine, sealing me inside a cage of steel and fiber bundles. Every connection was a fresh explosion of sensory data. I could feel the temperature of the room through the armor's external sensors, the pressure of the air against the pauldrons, and the rhythmic hum of the power pack as it ignited behind my shoulders. It was a sensation of total, terrifying empowerment, as if I had suddenly grown a body of mountain, stone and lightning. When the helmet was finally lowered over my head, the hiss of the pneumatic seals closing was the sound of the world being shut out forever. I was no longer a man breathing air. I was a biological component in a closed-loop life support system. My vision a high-definition tactical overlay that highlighted every tremor in the room with lethal precision. I took my first step in the full plate, and the floor of the sepulchre groaned under the weight, the sound echoing like a thunderclap in the stillness. The armor did not feel like a weight I was carrying. It felt like a part of my own body, moving with a speed and fluid grace that defied its massive bulk. I could feel the auto senses of the helmet amplifying the low, light environment, turning the shadows into a landscape of gray and emerald detail. The chaplain stepped forward, his skull mask reflecting the dim orange glow of the power pack's vents, and held out a weapon that felt as though it had been waiting for my hand since the dawn of time, a Godwin pattern bolter. As my gauntlet closed around the grip, the weapon's machine, spirit whispered its readiness to mine through the palm, link, a cold, metallic promise of absolute destruction. I was no longer a recruit, no longer a scout, and no longer human. I was a space marine, a literal angel of death, and the weight of that realization was more profound than any of the physical augmentations I had endured. The indoctrination reached its final, absolute peak as I was led to the reclusium for the oath of moment. I knelt before the chapter master, a figure of such monumental presence that the air seemed to warp around his golden, trimmed armor. I did not see a man. I saw a living icon of the Emperor's will, a warrior who had outlived empires and seen the birth of stars. As I recited the ancient oaths, my voice amplified by the helmet's vox grill into a deep, metallic rumble, I felt the final fragments of my old self, the boy from the hive, the child who feared the dark, dissolve into nothingness. They were replaced by a singularity of purpose, so intense it felt like a physical heat in my chest. I was a defender of humanity who would never again be part of it. A guardian who stood on the edge of the abyss, so that others could live in the light of a sun they would never see. I understood then that the recruitment was not a journey from one life to another, but a ritual sacrifice where the victim and the priest were the same person. I had offered up my soul on the altar of the Imperium, and in return, I had been given the power to strike down the gods of the warp. My first deployment as a full battle brother was to the world of Corin's Reach, a mining planet that had been overrun by a tide of Xenos filth. I remember standing in the bay of the Thunderhawk as it plummeted through the atmosphere, the roar of the engines and the scream of the wind, a symphony of war that filled me with a cold, righteous joy. When the ramp dropped, I did not run. I stepped out into the fire with the measured, unstoppable gait of a juggernaut. The air was a thick soup of dust, blood, and the high, pitched shrieks of the alien, but I moved through it with a clarity that was almost divine. Every pull of the bolter's trigger was a prayer, every detonating shell a testament to the Emperor's wrath. I saw the enemy not as living beings, but as tactical problems to be solved with the application of overwhelming force. I watched as a brother beside me was struck by a jagged shard of alien glass, the impact enough to kill a squad of mortal soldiers. Yet he did not even falter, his armor absorbing the blow as he continued to lay down a withering hail of fire. We were the iron wall against which the darkness broke, and for the first time, I felt the true meaning of brotherhood, not a bond of blood, but a bond of shared, eternal slaughter. I remember the taste of the air after the battle was won, a mixture of scorched ozone, promethium, and the sweet, sickly scent of alien decay. I stood atop a mound of broken carapaces and shattered weapons, my armor scorched and pitted by the fire of 1,000 enemies, and looked up at the stars. Somewhere out there, in the vast, uncaring void, were the worlds I would never visit, and the people I would never know. I felt no regret for the life I had surrendered, for I saw now that the galaxy was too cruel a place for the fragile things I had once cherished. I was a creature of the dark, forged in a mountain of iron and tempered in the blood of the faithless, and there was a grim, hollow peace in that knowledge. The cycle of my transformation was complete. I had become the very thing I had feared as a child, a giant of shadow and steel who walked among the ruins of civilization. I was the Emperor's shadow, his silent executioner, and as the transport arrived to take us to the next war zone, I knew that my journey would only truly end when my primary heart finally stopped beating and my gene seed was harvested to begin the nightmare anew for another boy from the hives. The recruitment of a space marine is a tragedy written in the language of glory. We are stolen from our families, broken on the wheels of science and faith, and rebuilt into monsters of incomparable lethality. We forget the names of our mothers, but remember the firing rate of a heavy bolter. We forget the feeling of a warm breeze, but remember the exact thermal signature of a dying heretic. It is a process of total, unremitting erasure that leaves behind only a husk of duty and a heart of cold, hard iron. As I sat in the darkness of the strike cruiser, the ship's engines humming a lullaby of destruction as we transitioned back into the warp, I looked at the reflections of my brothers in the polished floor. We were a legion of ghosts, bound together by the scars on our souls and the blood on our hands. waiting for the next opportunity to die for a throne we would never see and a master who would never speak to us. And yet, in that cold, silent chamber, I knew that I would not trade this burden for all the riches of the segmentum, for I was a space marine, and in a galaxy of infinite darkness, I was the fire that refused to go out.